so glad to be with you here this morning. Excited to be here at church and begin this new series in the wilderness. So if you've been coming and following along the last few weeks, you know we've been in this series called Resolved, about being resolved as a church to follow our core values, to share, to worship, to equip, and nurture. And it's really spoken to me and changed the way I've viewed my life, gone through my daily activities, viewed church. And so it's been really powerful, and I hope that it continues to be powerful in each one of our lives. That we can really remember that and hold on to that. That we can be people who are resolved. Amen? Yeah. Amen. So this morning, I'm excited to start a new series called In the Wilderness. You can see we've got some cool graphics up there. Thank you, Braden, that you don't have to look at my word art that would be up there if it wasn't for him. And so, we're starting this new series called In the Wilderness. And so, the wilderness is a really interesting idea, I think, because for some people it can be really like a romantic idea, right? Like the wilderness is a place that you dream about when you're at your desk at work, like, man, I wish I was in the wilderness, right? You see movies, you're like, man, I just need to go build a cabin in the middle of the woods. I mean, that's why we go camping, right? We go camping and hiking and hunting, fishing, to be outdoors, to be in the wilderness. Do I have any campers in the house today? Raise your hand if you like camping. All right, less than first service. Man, you guys got to catch up. Right? And so for some people, that's what the wilderness is. And then for other people, the wilderness can be a nightmare. It can be a place that's cold and miserable and dangerous and scary, right? Do I have any 5-star resort stayers in the house today? Where's your hand? There you go. All right. I know my family. We've got a camper and a resort stayer in my family. So there's always conflict there, right? Between those two sides. Right? So there can be good and there can be bad when you think about the wilderness. It's really a matter of perspective. It's a matter of how you view it. And kind of onto this, right? We have this idea of type 2 fun. Have you ever heard of type 2 fun? Okay, so type 1 fun is like going to Disneyland or coming to the Super Bowl party. It's just fun. Like there's no way to say it. Right? You just have fun while you're there and you look back and those memories are fun. Type 2 type of fun is in the moment is miserable. And then afterwards you have those good memories. Okay, and so when I think of type 2 type of fun, this summer we went on a hike. Braden, he's back there, and Andy, we were on that hike. We went through the enchantments. I don't know if you've ever heard of the enchantments, but they're like it's a really famous hike in Washington. People come from all over the world to do it, and so Stanton, he's a really good salesman, if you know him, which means liar, if you're a salesman. And he told me that, yeah, there's going to be this really cool hike. It's only like 15 miles, but come on, you can do it, right? You can do this hike. And so we go on this hike, and I kind of research it, and I'm like, pretty sure it's more than 15 miles, but we'll see what it is. And so we get there, we sleep there at the trailhead the night before, wake up, go on this hike all day. It turns out to be 22 miles. At the end, we were covered in blisters, and we're all sore. And we were all saying, I'm never doing this again. Like, I remember looking at Andy, he wore construction boots, and he just had sores all over his feet. He's like, yeah, I'm never doing that again, right? And I said the same thing, but then I caught myself like a couple weeks ago thinking, man, that was such a cool hike. Maybe we should do that again, right? So that's what type 2 type of fun is. You after the fact, you forget the pain, you forget the hardship, and you really are like, man, that was fun. But so this is kind of how we view the wilderness. It's a matter of perspective. The only thing that we're guaranteed as we go into the wilderness is it's going to be difficult, and that we're not going to be the same when we leave. Right? It's going to be difficult. What defines like an actual wilderness area in the U.S. is a place where you can't take any technology, you can't take wheels, you can't take any mechanics or any vehicles, and you can't build a structure. So like they say, like within this boundary, you can't do any of that stuff. That's where the wilderness is. Just leave it rugged. And so it's like kind of sink or swim, right? When you go in there, like you got to figure it out on your own. You're like really on your own. You remember what that's like. You're aware of that. It's a sink or swim moment. So it will be difficult when you go into the wilderness. You don't always know what those difficulties are going to be, what's going to come up, but you're guaranteed that it's going to be difficult. And then you're also guaranteed that you're going to be a different person when you come out. When I was a kid, if you've been around here for more than a week, you probably heard us talking about hunting. Hunting was always a big thing for us. And so at 10 years old was when you were allowed to go. And I remember coming back from that second hunting trip, and just like how I carried myself when I came back, I viewed myself differently. I thought, I have what it takes. I survived in the woods. I feel confident in myself. I was empowered by my time there in the wilderness. And that was an empowering time. But other people can be wounded. I was talking to a friend who, she was involved in this wilderness thing, and part of it, they had to do, look at a map and like guide themselves through the woods, and she doesn't know how to look at maps. So she got herself really lost, and the group lost, and they slept in the woods overnight. And she was just talking about how miserable it was and how she never wants to go back. Right? And so we can leave the woods, we're going to leave different, but do we leave empowered or do we leave wounded? Right? Because when we leave wounded, sometimes that fear keeps us from ever going back. And when we're empowered, it actually makes it so we can go deeper into the wilderness, deeper into those hardships. So we're guaranteed difficulty and we're guaranteed to be changed. And when we think about the wilderness, not as like the physical wilderness, but a spiritual or a metaphorical wilderness in our life, we all kind of know what that means, right? If I ask you, hey, are you in the wilderness right now? You know what that means. It means different things for each of us. But it's guaranteed to be difficult. It's guaranteed that there's going to be some unexpected dangers, some challenges. You probably aren't even going to know what the ending is going to turn out like, how you're going to get out of this situation, right? I mean, I think we all know that we go through times in our life like that, times that really feel like the wilderness. And in the same way that it's physically a sink or swim moment when you're in the physical wilderness, the spiritual wilderness can be the same. You can either sink and be wounded and scarred and become bitter coming out of there. You'll be changed by that. You won't handle situations the same when you leave, or you can be empowered. You can use that year's experiences to help other people, right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about over these next few weeks as we talk about the wilderness. Is what is it? Because we're all going to go through it, so how are we going to handle it, right? If we know it's coming, we better be prepared. If we know we're in it, we better be intentional about it. So we need to be intentional to learn and grow through the adversity. In this series, we're going to be looking at the life of a man who went both through physical wilderness and spiritual wilderness at the same time. We're going to be looking at the life of David. If you know anything about his story, your mind probably goes first to when he was in the wilderness running from Saul, right? That's like the most popular time of his life in the wilderness. He ran from Saul, but actually there was 3 significant moments where he spent time in the wilderness. As a boy, he was a shepherd, where his job was to live away from people and take care of the sheep in the wilderness. Then he goes and he's running from Saul. And in this moment of his life, he's also running from the wilderness. In the beginning, it was a different wilderness, though, right? As a shepherd, he was in the wilderness of abandonment. But then he's running from Saul, and he's being persecuted and chased, and so he's in this wilderness of persecution. Finally, he becomes king, messes up. His family turns against him, and his son tries to kill him, and he's in the wilderness again. And this time, he's in the wilderness of betrayal. And so we're going to be looking over the next 3 weeks at these different moments in David's life of a physical wilderness that actually was really impacting his spirit too. It was a spiritual wilderness for him. And so, like I said, this first wilderness we're going to be looking at is the wilderness of abandonment. If you're following along in your notes, we're going to be looking at this time. It's in 1 Samuel 16 and 17. And we'll be kind of jumping around through there, but that's where we'll be at this morning. Looking at the time when David was a shepherd. And we can all relate, right? Because we all go through wilderness. We all find ourselves in the wilderness at times in our life. We can feel like we're in the thick of it. How are we going to get out? Sometimes we don't know what that ending is going to look like. But I think it's important to talk about that today. And so really the message, the sentence, the statement that we're going to hold on to as we go through this is there on the top of your notes. It says, we all go through the wilderness, so how will we face it? Because how we face it changes how we leave it. Right? How we face it changes how we leave it. So let's pray this morning as we look at God's word. God, I thank you so much for your word, how it speaks to us. Lord, there is power in your word, and so I pray this morning as we look at the life of David, as we look at what it means to go through the wilderness, God, that you'd be speaking to us, working in and through us, God. Lord, that the wilderness of our life, Lord, would draw us closer to you. Lord, that we learn to put our hope and our trust in you through it all. Lord, that we'd be better people, more equipped, more prepared as we come out, that we'd be empowered by the wilderness. Thank you, Jesus. In your name, amen. Amen. So, like I said this morning, we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 16 and 17. Now, this is when we really first meet David in the Bible. A little history. Saul is king of Israel. God chose him as king. He failed. So God said, I'm going to pick another king. And so, as a result of that, Samuel is the one that goes around and anoints the new king. and God tells them, hey, you're going to go to this house of the man Jesse and pick one of his sons. Now, if you're the king, like Saul, and you know that God's going to pick someone else, you're probably going to keep your eye on the man who's going to pick that new king, right? And so Samuel's scared. He says, God, I'm going to go there in secret. So he goes in secret to this house of a man named Jesse. And God told him, hey, anoint one of his sons as king. So Jesse brings out all of his sons. He's got a big family. He brings out all of his sons, brings them before Samuel. Samuel looks through them all, and God says, nope, none of these guys. So that's where we're picking it up. 1 Samuel 16, starting in verse 11. 1 Samuel 16, verse 11. So Samuel asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So they sent for him, and had brought him in. He was glowing with health, and had a fine appearance and a handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And Saul went to Ramah. So this is when we're first introduced to David, right? This time of the wilderness. And it doesn't really describe him being in the wilderness, but we can kind of look at it and derive that from this, right? So he was a shepherd. And what we know about shepherds is they were people that lived out in the middle of nowhere, right? And we talk about this a lot in Christmas, right? Shepherding was not a coveted position. But like I said, sometimes I think we lose the impact of what it would have meant for him to be out there alone. Especially in the U.S., right? I always think like, man, I wish I could just live in the country, right? That's like a cool thing to do now. It wasn't cool back then. The idea of like the hero always comes from the wilderness, like John Wayne comes riding out of the desert, right? Like that's what we think of. That's not what's happening here. David is not triumphantly coming out with his cool clothes and his cowboy hat. And I didn't really understand what it would have actually been for someone like this to come out of nowhere, out of the wilderness, until I was in Peru. We went to Peru part of my time in Colombia to do a pastor's training. So pastors came from all over the country, some from the city, some from the country, some from the middle of nowhere in the jungle. So there were people there that had come from 3 days on boats, on cars, on horses, come out of like the middle of nowhere to be up here, to be at that conference. And it was striking the difference between someone from the country and someone from the city. Like someone from the real middle of nowhere and someone from the city. I could not understand their Spanish. I'm not great at Spanish, but I could not understand a word they said. The Colombians with me couldn't even understand them, even though they're speaking the same language, just because they were real country bumpkins, right? They looked different. Like, even just the way that they interacted with people, they didn't really know how to talk to people very well. They kind of were just like looking around a lot. I don't know if they were like amazed by the buildings or whatever it was, but like you could tell they're out of place, right? You could tell that they didn't belong there. And so I imagine what that was like when the shepherds came out of the fields, right? And they come into the town, they haven't been around people a lot. They haven't had social interactions. They haven't even been watching TV to know how to talk to people, right? So they're coming and encountering people, and people look down on them. Like, I don't know how to have a conversation with you because you're socially awkward and you smell, right? And so they're kind of put off to the side. They're put out of the way. They're despised. So this position of David being appointed as shepherd was not a good thing, right? It's not really a thing that you're like, you're going to take over my family one day. I'm going to make you the shepherd so you can learn what it's like to have real responsibility. No, this was actually, he was banished to this place. He was banished to this position. It wasn't a good thing. He was despised even by his brothers for being there. We'll see that going on, but they looked down on him. They kind of spat on him about that. But what I think is even more impactful from this story is not that he was abandoned to the field, but that he was forgotten by his father. Because it says Samuel comes to Jesse and says, hey, show me all of your sons. Present to me all of your sons. He brings everyone out except for David. And can you imagine what it's like to be forgotten by your father when he says, hey, can I see your kids? Like, hey, how are your kids doing? Oh, Billy's doing this, Sally's doing this, and then you just don't talk about one of your kids? Like, that's what's happening here. He forgot about him, whether it was intentional or not. I mean, that's got to do crazy things, even psychologically to someone, to be forgotten by your father like that. To be looked at differently from all of your brothers like that. He was forgotten. I mean, on a lesser extent, it's kind of like PE. I don't know if you guys remember back to elementary school PE, right? It's time to pick teams, and everyone's picking teams. And I went to school with Braden. Now, if you've ever seen Braden run, he's really fast, okay? So no matter what sport you're playing in elementary school, being fast is always good. So everyone picked Braden, and I can't catch a football, or any balls, actually. And so I would always get picked last, okay? So I a little bit know what it's like to be picked last. Maybe some of you guys can relate, or maybe some of you got picked first. And you know what? You're going to learn that that's not a good place to be at the end of the story. No, but we know it doesn't feel good to be left out and to be abandoned. Like, that is not a good feeling. That is not an empowering feeling for David. So he's coming out of this physical wilderness, but really this deep spiritual and psychological wilderness of being abandoned and despised. But even outside of that, sometimes we can feel abandoned by God, right? I mean, that's what the real deep wilderness is. It's if you've convinced yourself that God is abandoning you. That not only have I been forgotten by other people, but I actually, I'm this way because God forgot about me. God forgot to give me anything that I'm good at. God forgot to give me a purpose. That can be a lie that we tell ourselves. And I'm here to tell you this morning, if you hear nothing else, God has not abandoned you. God has not abandoned you. God has not forgotten you. You might feel worthless or feel like you don't have anything to contribute. Like you don't have any, people don't want you as friends. Bosses don't want you in promotions. God has not abandoned you. It says in Psalms 139, you were fearfully and wonderfully made. That when God formed you, even before you were born, as He planned out your life, He looked at you, not just those good people, those people that are going to be on stage and those people that are going to accomplish a lot. He looked at you and said, I have a purpose for your life. I have a purpose for your life. It's not a generalization. God created you with a purpose. Each individual person, not just humanity as a whole, He created you with a purpose.
Yeah.
Maybe you can't see it. Maybe you struggle with that. Well, guess what? You're human. You know, in the same way that maybe your boss can't see it, maybe your friends can't see it, your parents didn't see it, your spouse doesn't see it. You don't see it because you're human, right? I mean, David's parents, or David's dad, David's brothers, they didn't see the potential in him. Samuel didn't even see him. If we look back to verse 7, God says, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. This is Samuel going to one of the brothers of David. It says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. That's it. We could just end right there, and that's a good enough for today, right? The Lord does not look at what people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So that's your first point there if you're following along your notes. The Lord looks at your heart. Maybe, like I said, you feel like God left you out. He forgot you when you gave out talents. You were the last one, right? He forgot to give you any special abilities or purpose. That's not true. God created you with a purpose, and He sees your heart. Even in the middle of feeling abandoned, even in the middle of nowhere, whether that's literal nowhere or a spiritual nowhere, God sees your heart. God looks at you. If that's something you're struggling with, declare this week, I'm going to focus on what God sees. I'm not going to look at myself the way that people look at me or people look at the world. I'm not going to look at the outward appearance because that's not what the Lord looks at. It says the Lord looks at the heart. And because of that, I recognize I have a purpose. I have a calling on my life. Yeah. That should change the way that we live once we recognize that. That God is looking at my heart. That in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of being abandoned, God sees my heart. So we go on, and in the story, Saul knows that someone's going to be anointed king, but he doesn't know David's anointed as king. Samuel did it in secret. So Saul is in distress. It says that he's tormented by an evil spirit. He probably was going through some pretty hardcore depression. He was going through some anxiety, and so he says, I need someone to come play music to calm me. So without knowing that David is the one who's just been anointed king, pick up verse 18, it says, one of the servants answered, I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Now that last part's kind of weird, right? If you're like, I need a good guitar player. Well, I know this guy plays guitar, and he's a fine-looking man. You're like, why would you say that? That's just awkward, right? Why did they add that part? I have no idea. There's no spiritual connection to that, so just skip over that. That guy's weird. But it says that the Lord is with him. And so David worshipped while he was in the wilderness, and that's what it takes for us. Next point is worship your way through the wilderness. See, lots of people can use music in times when they're struggling, maybe their heart got broken, whatever it is. Music is powerful, right? Like I have a playlist on my Spotify called Feels. And so whenever I just want to cry, I'll just turn on that playlist and just start thinking about things, and I'll just start crying probably, right? Because music has an impact on our life. We recognize that. It gets us through hard times. It makes the good times better. But that's not what we're talking about here, because it doesn't say, I know this son of Jesse who is amazing at playing the lyre. It says, I know a son of Jesse who plays the lyre, and God is with him. See, the difference is that he was a worshiper. That God was with him, and that his music actually had a purpose beyond what it does to us mentally. Right? There's a spiritual aspect to his music. David was actually really one of the first worship leaders, the first worship ministers. Sometimes we think like that's something we created here in America. No, the early church was full of worship. When they were waiting for God at Pentecost for the Holy Spirit, it says they were worshiping with songs and psalms. We see when they dedicate the temple, there's songs and praise, and here David is singing. So the worship ministry of musical worship is important. My dad talked a few weeks ago about worship, right? Worship is simply giving worth to God. What I'm talking about today is specifically musical worship. Because there's also a very strong power to that. Right? That song that we were singing, your praise will ever be on my lips. What does that mean? What does that mean to us? That's what worship is. That's what the heart of worship is. It's that his praise is always on our lips. And when we think about the wilderness, I really believe that in the same way the physical wilderness, sometimes we can get without food, and that makes us weak. The same way worship is food to our souls. It's food to our spirit. I mean, have you ever... Yeah, it's food to us. And without it, we'll die. David sang to survive in the wilderness. Why did he do this? I mean, it's because it turned his focus from the problem onto the Lord. And that's what worship does for us. Even this morning as we sang that song in believing for healing for these people, right? We can focus on the problem, and we can feel sad, but we can focus on God as the healer. And that's what it is. Worship turns our focus onto God. It brings our focus back to God. Have you ever noticed, like, when there's issues in your life, problems, you just really focus on that? Man, can't believe I got a ticket today. It's the worst. And then you just think about it. Pretty soon your whole life is falling apart because you got pulled over. Right? Like, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, sure, things come in life, and we can acknowledge the pain. We can acknowledge the hurt in our life when things come. That's healthy. That's good. But we don't focus on it. And what worship does is it takes our focus from that problem and puts it on God. And just like we can leave the wilderness, right, with a different perspective. Some people love it, some people hate it. Often that's from a perspective issue. And so as we go through our spiritual wilderness, what is your perspective? That's what worship does, is it changes our perspective. Usually people who leave hurt and wounded, it's because they were focused on the problem. People who leave empowered was because they focused on how they got out of it. And for us as Christians, we know that comes from focusing on God as our Savior, as our hope. So acknowledge where you're at, acknowledge the pain, but then turn your focus to the Lord. If you're going through it, begin to lift up a song and sing. You know, worship is a spiritual discipline. In the same way, maybe you're a new Christian, or maybe you've seen new Christians, and you ask them, hey, do you want to pray to close us out in a small group today? And their eyes are like, I could pray? Like, oh my, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to pray. Right? But their prayer means nothing more to the Lord than my prayer does. But as you pray, you begin to develop that spiritual discipline in your life. And so it's not that you can't do it from the beginning, but you have to develop that. In the same way, we have to develop that spirit of worship in us. Many of you guys know Garrett Hansen. He taught me how to play guitar, and I'm so thankful to him for that. But the thing I'm actually most grateful to him for was he taught me how to worship. There's a difference, and it's something we have to develop in ourselves. So if we're going to worship our way through the wilderness, we need to be intentional about it. Just like prayer, we need to be intentional about it. About preparing ourselves through worship. It'll change your focus. It'll change your perspective. I challenge you, as you get hyper-focused on something in a problem, whatever it is in your life, go to worship and see what happens. See what happens when you go to worship. You don't know, literally just go on YouTube and type in worship and something will come up. Maybe you don't know a song. All the music platforms have it. whatever is your go-to, but be intentional about worship in your life, because that's what the food is through the wilderness for you. I really believe that that's your food that carries you through. There's something that you sometimes we try to figure out, well, what does it actually do? I don't know what it does to us all the time. When I prepare my messages, sometimes I have a good idea and I just hit a wall. I can't get anywhere with it. And I just sit down and begin to worship the Lord. And it's amazing. I don't think I can write messages without the Lord, without worship. Because the Lord does something in me, changes my spirit, and I'm able to focus on Him, hear from Him, get direction from Him. It's the same for us as we go through the wilderness.
Good.
So, going back, we first need to remember that the Lord looks at our heart, that He has not abandoned us. Amen? He has not abandoned us. Then we worship our way through the wilderness, because worship brings our focus back to God. Continuing on, so David, he would occasionally come in from the field to play for the king, right? So this wasn't a full-time gig. He was just playing on the weekends. But he was still in the wilderness. He's still working with the sheep. And as we go to the next chapter, chapter 17, we see the story of David and Goliath. And David enters this chapter, and it says that he was traveling back and forth between his time with the king and his time with the sheep. He was going back and forth. And in 1 Samuel 17:20, he leaves the flock, so he leaves the sheep in the wilderness to bring food to his brothers, and he sees Goliath mocking the people of God. So Goliath is out there saying, look how puny your God is. He can't save you. And David hears this and he gets angry. And he looks and he sees his brothers on the front lines, lined up for battle, and he says, why aren't you guys doing anything? And they shame him, right? They remind him, you're just from the wilderness. You're supposed to be a shepherd, right? Go back to your sheep. This isn't where you're supposed to be. You haven't been trained for this. You haven't been prepared for this. Go back. You were abandoned there. Go back to where you were abandoned to. And so instead of leaving, remember he's friends with the king now, because he's his lyre player. So he goes to Saul. He says, what's going to happen here? Is no one going to go up? Because if no one goes to take care of this giant, I'll do it. And Saul, if you know the story, he says, well, you're not prepared. You're not a warrior. How are you going to do this? I have lots of warriors that can't do it, but you're not prepared. And David's response is so powerful. Starting in 1 Samuel 17:34, if you're following along, it says, David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Wow, what a statement, right? And so, see, David the king said, you're not prepared for this, right? You haven't been to How to Be a Soldier 101. You haven't been through the training. You don't have the weapons. But David was saying, actually, God was preparing me in ways that I didn't even see. That as a shepherd, he was actually being trained to become one of the greatest fighters in Israel's history. Going back to this idea of a shepherd, right? He's abandoned. He doesn't have any esteem in that thing. But one thing that kind of strikes me about that passage that we just read is it says that there was lions and bears. So I know there's lions in the desert, right? But have you ever thought, is there bears in the desert? Is that just my thought? I think of bears living in the mountains or the woods. I didn't know there's bears that lived in the desert. I've been to Africa. I didn't see any bears there, right? So I was kind of like, what? That's kind of weird. So I began to research a little bit. There's actually a bear. It's called the Syrian brown bear, and it lives in this area, in this region. To give you some perspective, it's about 600 pounds. So imagine a really large black bear or a small grizzly bear. That's about where this guy fits in. Okay? So it's not like one of those little sloth bears or panda bears from Asia, right? This guy is no joke. Right? This is a real bear. But can you imagine encountering, not even from this story, just in general, encountering a bear in the wilderness? I think about this a lot because I'm kind of a warrior and I like to be prepared. And so whenever I'm out in the woods, I'm like, man, I hope I don't see a bear. And so I have a gun that I carry, and when I'm in an area where I think there might be some, but I'm always thinking about what would happen, right? I'm prepared. Imagining what the scenario would be like. Well, now imagine that same scenario, right, where you're walking through the woods, you encounter a bear, but then you change that gun for a rock, okay? That's where David is at right now. Like, that's just not fun. Like, I'm already worried with a gun, and now I have a rock. Like, what? I'm out of there. Yeah, count me out. And so sometimes we assume that David's job as a shepherd was to fight lions and bears. I don't think that's real. I don't think that's true. Right? If you're the lowest rung of society, no one has expectations on you, are you really going to put your life at risk to do your job? I assume that when that bear, that lion comes to take one of your sheep, you're just going to count that off of your taxes as a business expense, okay? Right? Like, at least you didn't take them all. I guess you can have that one, right? It's kind of like the mob. Just take a little off the top, and they won't kill you. That's what's happening here with the bears and the lions. I lived in Medellin, so I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the mob. But let's be honest, like, if I'm a shepherd, I'm going to do an okay job at my work and guarantee survival. Like, that's kind of my metric of what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do everything I can to stop that lion if it means I'm going to die, because that doesn't mean that much. It's the same reason I'm not a NASCAR driver, right? Like, I'm not willing to push the limits to see how far I can go, that maybe I'll die. Well, also I have a small bladder, so I couldn't be a NASCAR driver. But like, I'm not willing to push those limits. Like, I'm going to take these jobs, and if it means there's danger to my life, then I'm probably not going to do that. But David didn't have that perspective. So what's amazing, he had this job, we talk about he's abandoned, he's disgraced, people are making fun of him, hey, go back to your sheep. He's like, you know what? If I'm abandoned here to the wilderness to be a shepherd, I'm going to be the best shepherd that there ever was. I'm going to be willing to put my life on the line for a sheep. Like, that does not seem like a good trade, to put your life on the line for a sheep, but that's what he did. And when we talk about this wilderness of abandonment, a lot of us can get frustrated in life, right? But whether you feel abandoned in your job, in your state in life, you just feel like you're stuck. It reminds me of the movie Rudy. Has anyone seen the movie Rudy? Right? Great football movie, because it doesn't have that much to do with football. But Rudy is this guy that's really small, and he wants to be a football player. He keeps failing, and so everyone's like, "Hey, why don't you just conform? Recognize that you're not going to get there, and just go on with your life, right?" And he never gives up. He never quits striving. And what's interesting is because his unwillingness to give up, his unwillingness to conform to mediocrity really exposes everyone else of where they're at, I think. And we can't accept mediocrity and expect to be prepared. Like, if we're saying, I don't like where I'm at, I wish I was at this other place, I'm just gonna accept mediocrity here. That's not preparing you for the next step, right? Like, sometimes we think, when we look at the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, God says, hey, I give 1 talent to some people, 5 talents to another. He who is faithful with much or with little, more will be given. Right? He didn't say, he who has that 1 talent and doesn't really do anything about it, but has a great business plan for what he'll do with 5 talents, that's the one I'm going to give the more talents to. But he says, who was faithful with little will be given much. And so David's being prepared to fight Goliath was not by him preparing himself in the conventional way. God was preparing him in his excellence in where he was at. God prepares us for what's to come by being excellent where you're at. Right? It's easy to say, I got to go to that next step. That's what I really need to be preparing myself for. No, God is preparing you where you're at. And if you're not willing to say, I'm going to do all that I can, I'm waiting for that next step, it's probably not going to come. Right? You haven't shown yourself faithful with that talent. For the Israelites, it was an honor to go fight. The fact that his brothers got to go, that was an honor. They got to fight for the country, fight for their family, and David didn't have that honor. He was left behind, and we remember, right, David was just anointed king. If you're anointed king, he's probably thinking, it's a good step along the journey to be king to go to battle, to go to fight. Like, that's what I would be thinking, like, hey, I got to start somewhere. Got to get my name out there somewhere. But he's abandoned, and I can imagine him just there in the wilderness crying out to heaven, God, why have you abandoned me here? Like, if you're saying I'm going to be king, why aren't you preparing me for that? But let's assume for a minute that Jesse, David's father, said, hey, you're anointed king, why don't you go off to war with your brothers? Forget being there with the sheep, forget that wilderness that I've abandoned you to. We got to start preparing you sometime, so let's send you off to war. If he wasn't out there in the wilderness, if he was on the front lines, where would he have been when Goliath came? Have you thought about that? Where would he have been? He'd probably be there alongside his brothers, cowering in fear. Right? Because they were trained in a way that they thought was the best way to train themselves, but it did not prepare them for what was to come. Where would the story have gone if that was different? See, God was preparing David to be one of the best warriors that Israel ever saw in the most unconventional way possible. In a way that David did not even recognize that he was being prepared. The wilderness prepared him to be a warrior. And so maybe you have received a promise of God in your life saying, God, I know you've called me to this. I know this is where you're going to take me, but I don't see how I'm being prepared for that. Be excellent where you're at. There's no question that being excellent where you're at, that being a workman and need not be ashamed, that honoring God in that will prepare you for what's to come. That if God is calling you to something, He's not going to just leave you unprepared, but that preparation is probably going to look different than what you thought it was going to be. God has not abandoned you, and He's preparing you in ways you can't see. David prepared himself by being faithful. He chose to make use of that time and let God prepare him. And so, because of that, he was able to defeat Goliath. Now, the outcome of this wilderness, right? He goes, puts a rock right between the eyes, cuts off his head, and Israel takes this a momentum shift, right? Israel was saying before, hey, we're going to lose, to hey, let's go kill all of the enemy. And they just charge and take over the Philistines. It's a huge momentum change in that war. There was a momentum shift, and it was because David had prepared himself, had taken that time of preparation. So sometimes we come into contact with times, hey, this is a momentum shift moment in my life, but am I prepared? Right? Because we get to those times like, oh man, maybe I should have been doing a little more studying for that test before I knew that was coming, right? And that's how we think. That moment is not when we prepare. We're prepared before we see those things coming. So we need to be preparing ourselves in the wilderness. I don't know if you guys, those who like football, if you've been watching some of the Chief games, but that is a momentum, or an example of momentum shift. Right? Like 2 games ago, I think they were playing the Titans. They were down 24-0 in the first quarter. And we walked into a restaurant, and I was just thinking, man, that team must suck. I don't know how they got here, right? And they scored their first touchdown, and I remember Luke looking at me, he's like, why are they celebrating? It's 7-24, right? Like, what are they celebrating right now? But what they were celebrating was a momentum shift. Because if you watch that game, it turned out they scored more points than anyone else in a postseason game, I think. It's like 54 to something. Right? They came back and totally won that game and really brought themselves out of the wilderness of 50 years outside of the Super Bowl. Right? But it wasn't in that moment when they scored that touchdown, they're like, hey, we better start preparing ourselves right now, you know? Like, now's the time to start going to practice, start lifting those weights. No, they had to prepare themselves before. Prepare themselves in the wilderness. They didn't know what was to come, but they were preparing themselves. The same way God is growing us in the wilderness. It's not wasted time. It's not wasted time. We need to change our idea of what waste is. I mean, if I'm going to be king, I can imagine thinking spending time with sheep is a waste of time. There's not too many kingly duties that taking care of sheep really translates to, I don't think. Maybe people are like sheep, I don't know. Maybe that's how it works out. But really, like, David could not have known that God was preparing him for this, except for that he trusted God. And so we need to do the same, that when we can't see God, where are you carrying me through to? What are those promises? I can't see how they're coming. That we need to believe that He is preparing us, that we can be excellent where we're at, and that will prepare us. Because God does not let this time of wilderness become a waste. And so, if we're saying, hey, I'm going to be prepared in this time of the wilderness, what are we preparing ourselves for? What are we preparing ourselves for? That's a real question, right? Like, we can say, hey, to serve others, or these different things, but really I think what it's preparing us for in general is to be that reflection of Christ. That's what we've been called to be as Christians, to reflect Christ. And so, wherever you see yourself on that journey, if you are trying to get to the next step, be excellent where you're at now. Today is the day to begin to prepare yourself. Today is the day to start fighting sin. It's not when you know more about the Bible. That's not when you start fighting sin. It gets harder, actually. So begin now. Begin to fight that sin in your life now. Begin to become that father, that husband, that mother, that wife, that's more like Christ, that knows how to love their family like Christ now. That doesn't come when you get to some spiritual elevated level. We need to start preparing ourselves for that now. Be people of the Word now. Get it in God's Word. Maybe you didn't do it yesterday. Begin today. Maybe you didn't start our Bible reading plan in January. You can start in February. You don't have to read our Bible reading plan, but be in the Word. Start now to grow and to develop disciples, to look at people and say, hey, how can I work in them? That's how we prepare ourselves. Right? It's being faithful in those little things. That's what prepares ourselves for that next step. So God looks at our heart. We need to remember that He has not abandoned us. He sees our heart. That we worship our way through this wilderness. That's what turns our focus to Him. And that we're being prepared by being excellent where we're at. Now in closing, it's interesting because David was singing before, but we don't know necessarily what he was singing. He was singing Psalms. Sorry, if he was singing Psalms, we don't know. Because although he wrote most of the Psalms, he didn't start until this moment. The first Psalm that he ever wrote, Psalms 9, and he wrote it after the defeat of Goliath. If you want to turn there, we're not going to read the whole thing. It's a great psalm. But Psalms 9, it's a psalm that he wrote after he killed Goliath. And really, this is when he kills Goliath and he kind of comes out of this wilderness, right? Because then the king has him join his army and moves into his house. So this is really when we see David's reflection on that time back in the wilderness, on what that meant to him. It says, starting in verse 7, the Lord reigns forever. He established His throne of judgment. He rules the world in righteousness and judges people with equity. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. For those who know your name, trust in you. For you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. What a promise. What a way to view his time in the wilderness. That the Lord had never forsaken him. Right? In the moment he felt forsaken, I can guarantee you that. But he said, my hope is not in what I see. My hope is in the Lord. That's what carried him through. He said, my hope is in the Lord. And that's the most important thing that he learned. That's the most important thing we can learn in our wilderness. Is our hope is in the Lord. You feel like you're going through the wilderness now? Like all the safety nets are gone. You don't know how you're getting out of a situation in your life. You don't know how you're going to be healed or how you're going to come out not scarred. The Lord has not forgotten you. Remember that the Lord has not forgotten you. Sometimes we think that He's punishing us for something we did. That's not how God works. It says good things come from our Father. That there are consequences to our actions, not from Him, but from our own doing, right? We have natural consequences. Even sin is a consequence of the fall, not from us, but from humanity. From when Adam took that. But that's not God punishing us. That's not God saying, hey, look how powerful I am. Look what I'm doing. There's natural consequences. The wilderness isn't from God, but He can redeem the wilderness. Not just to take that time and make sure it wasn't wasted, but actually make sure it was productive. Make sure it's launching you into something new. That the time in the wilderness not only is just a time that we got through okay, but actually it prepared us. It pushed us forward to something new. And we often don't see it until we get out. We often don't recognize what it was really preparing us for until we get out. I'll share a little bit about my time in Colombia, but really the time that was really hard. It was a harder time for me this time, but the hardest moment was I moved into a new home with a family, gotten back late that night. It's a house built on another house, so we're on the second floor. 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm woken up to this lady just screaming. Not angry, but like she's in pain. For 15 minutes, I just hear her screaming, her husband yelling at her. Sounds like they're fighting. I don't know what's going on. But they're screaming. I'm hearing everything, and they're right below me. Sounds like, she's screaming for her life. And all of a sudden the door gets kicked in. Some guys come in. I hear the shuffling, I hear the talking, and then the guy starts screaming. And then they end up taking him outside. I hear him screaming outside. 20 minutes, and the area that the gang for our neighborhood was right across the street from us. I always knew that. They never had a problem as long as you don't mess with them. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, I hear this guy get dragged across, screaming, and then I hear some gunshots. In the house that I lived in, there was really nice people, but they didn't take care of their house super well. The lock had broken the week before on the house. And I was scared, let me tell you. There's not been a moment in my life where I have encountered that much fear. And it was interesting because before I went, I really felt like God had given me a word and said, don't be afraid, but just serve because I will protect you. I felt like God had spoken to me that, and I didn't know what that was from because I'd had some sketchy times, but nothing like this. And in that moment, I completely forgot that promise from the Lord. I mean, it's just reality. I did not hold on to that. I mean, I was ready to go home. I couldn't imagine staying there for one more moment. I was ready to buy a ticket the next day and come back. And luckily the next day I talked to our pastor a little bit. We prayed about it. Time went on and things began to settle down a little bit. I began to get perspective, and I thought, if I would have left that day, I really would have left wounded from Colombia. I might have never gone back to the mission field because that might have built up in my heart that fear, that not trusting God. I mean, it's scary to think what could have happened, not to my life, but to my heart in that moment. And although that was a really, one of the scariest moments of my life, just thinking, I'm the only white guy in this neighborhood. They know that I have money, and they know where I live. The gang knows where I live. There's no lock on the door. I have nothing I can do to protect myself. It was a feeling of hopelessness. But I realized, thinking back to some of the heroes that I always looked to in my life, whether it was from the Bible, Daniel, going through the fiery furnace, but even missionaries that I looked up to. Stephen's dad, Bob Finke, lived in Medellin in some of the most dangerous times. I mean, there was more homicides there than anywhere else in the world. It's worse than the Middle East is now, is what it was like. There were bombs going off, people getting killed, and what it would have taken to stay in that place. What do you hold on to? Because the same spirit, the same motivation, it's not that he's just some person who's brave. It's not that these people that went off to Africa and packed their bags in their coffin were so brave. But it was that their hope was in the Lord. And that's what took those experiences, those moments that should have been so hurtful. And God showed me who he was in that moment. He said, look, I promised you this, and I will hold fast to that promise. That you never have to fear that. It doesn't mean that bad things aren't coming, but it means I have good things for you. I want to show you who I am. I want to take these times in the wilderness and show you that your hope can be put in me. That you don't need to lose faith in those times. And see, it's true for us. It's so true for us in this message of the wilderness, this message of abandonment. That we can go through these times that are hard, but our hope has to be in the Lord. Because if it's not, we will leave wounded. We will leave hurt. When our hope is in the Lord, he empowers us. He shows us more of who he is. I mean, what more can we ask for in this life than to know a little bit more about who God is? To experience his faithfulness, his powerful. And I would go through that experience again just to learn what I learned about who God is. There's not a moment of going through the wilderness that I can look back on and say, God, you weren't faithful to me. And I haven't experienced things like Pastor Derek or his family. But as we go through these times in the wilderness, we can hold fast to who God is. That can be our hope. And so I don't know where you're at. Maybe you've put your hope in the Lord before. Maybe you said, God, I put my hope in you, but life's gotten easy. Things come up, things distract you. Take this moment as we sing this song, to say, God, my hope is in you. That whether I'm in the wilderness now or whether the wilderness is to come, my hope will always be in you. And I'm looking for how you're preparing me through this time. How you're working on me through this time. Maybe you're here this morning and you've never put your hope in the Lord. That's what our faith is about. It's not about a list of rules. It's not about going to church. It's not about being a good person. It's about saying, God, I put my hope in you. That when Jesus died on the cross for us, it says that he took our shame upon him. That abandonment that we feel from people, from our situations, that God took that upon himself. And then he said, I want to have a relationship with you, and I'm willing to go through this just so I can carry that for you. Just so you can know that you will never be abandoned. So no matter where we're at, we need to cry out to God and say, my hope is in you. My trust is in you. This morning as we sing, I really want that to be the focus of our hearts. Looking at my life and saying, God, whatever I go through, my hope is in you. Whatever I go through, God, I believe that you are working. Even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I can't feel it, you're working. That last question on the bottom of your sheet says, this week I'm choosing to be empowered through my time in the wilderness by. That's assuming that we're choosing to be empowered, not wounded, right? It's my hope for all of us, is that we will be empowered by our time in the wilderness. Because it's going to come. We all go through the wilderness, so how will we face it? Because how we face it will change how we live it. Would you guys stand with me this morning as we close in prayer? And Luke can lead us in a song. Lord, we thank you that our hope, our trust is in you. God, that you have made a way through the wilderness for us. That way came through your Son, Jesus Christ, who died for us, God. Lord, that way comes through your Spirit that's moving in us. Lord, that even when it feels like the world's crashing down, God, you have good things for us. Why? Because you see our hearts. You have not abandoned us. Let us hold on to that truth, God. Lord, as we go through our life, Lord, let us be people that worship our way through the wilderness. Lord, let us always be turning our focus back to you, God, that would change our perspective. Lord, that no matter what we face, we can say, my God is working. My God has good things for me. I'm believing that if I'm excellent where I'm at, if I'm faithful where I'm put, that he will be preparing me for what he has for me. Lord, let us cast away all fear. Lord, if we've been hurt, if we've been broken through the wilderness, God, heal our hearts. Lord, take those times that the enemy meant for evil, God, and turn them for good. Redeem the wilderness, God. Lord, not only just to not be bad, God, but to be a momentum shift in our life that pushes us forward. Let us put our hope, our trust in you, God. Lord, no matter what we encounter, God, let us put our hope and our trust in you. Lord, we thank you for your word, God, that speaks to us. God, for your Spirit that speaks to us. Let us hold fast to that. Let us leave this place, God, as people who are changed. People who are dedicated, God, to being prepared in the wilderness. Thank you, Jesus. You are holy. You are holy.
Stop working. see, if we don't respond to these things, then our hearts can become calloused, and then we don't hear as well the next time. So it's important that we respond, be responsive to these things. So we're going to close in prayer. You're welcome to leave. You're welcome to stay, and you're welcome to come back at 3 o'clock. So thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you for being receptive to God's word. Thank you, Nathan, for sharing God's word that you put in your heart. God, we thank you so much that you have the big picture. God, that you have not abandoned us. God, whatever the wildernesses that we feel like we're in our life, God, you are there with us. And God, we choose to put our trust in you at this moment. We choose to trust you, God, that you will take us through this. We choose to worship you. God, we choose to put our hope and our trust in you. So God, I thank you for each person that you brought here this morning. God, I thank you for the work that you're doing in their lives. And God, this morning as we go from here, help us to take this message and to live it out. Not just be hearers, but to be doers of your word, Jesus. Thank you. Thank you that your Spirit works in us. In your holy name. God bless you.